Hello BookTube. Today I'm going to be doing the Reading Shifts tag. This tag was created by Hannah of Hannah's Books, and she kindly tagged me in the comments to her original video. I will leave a link to her channel in the show notes down below, as well as mentions of any books that I mention in this video. Let's get started. Question number 1. How has your reading developed over your lifetime? Do the kind of books that bring you the most pleasure now differ from the books you loved most earlier in your life? If you've seen big changes in your reading since you've matured, what might explain your changing interests? So let's go with the first part of this question. How has your reading developed over your lifetime? So since I've been an adult reader, my reading life has been dominated by phases where I am most interested in a specific genre or group of books. So to give a quick rundown, I became an adult reader at the age of 11 or 12, and at that point I was most interested in mysteries. And this phase lasted for a few years until my mid-teens. From there, I began to get interested in adult science fiction and fantasy in prose form. And a little bit later, I also began to become drawn to what I have come to call classics, canonical, modern, and contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama. Or basically literature of the higher variety. I don't want to be, the reason why I call it classics, canonical, modern, and contemporary fiction, poetry, and drama is because I don't want to play into a snob's game with that group, but it's hard not to, even if you're not a book snob. So for much of my later teens and into my early and mid-20s, I was mostly interested in science fiction and fantasy and literature. Gradually, at the end of a few years after the end of my academic life, I fell out of reading literature and focused largely on science fiction and fantasy. And this lasted for a very long time until I discovered BookTube. At that point, I started to get inklings of wanting to get back into literature, but that's a discussion for a little bit later. So I stuck with science fiction and fantasy until the end of 2019. When I don't know what the heck happened, but I started losing interest in science fiction and fantasy, and that lack of interest has continued for years now. Right now I have no interest in science fiction and fantasy, and when I try to force myself to read it for a BookTube event or something, it does not go well. So starting in 2020, I started to get interested in history, and that lasted for a little bit. At the end of 2020, I also started to get into manga again. I was interested in manga a little bit, about a decade before this, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, but nothing like my interest in manga now, which has, the last year or two, really begun to dominate my reading life, as my interest in history has waned somewhat, if not significantly. And of course, I'm still trying to figure, there's this weird sense of literature trying to make a comeback, and not being terribly successful about it. Uh, do the kind of books that bring you the most pleasure now differ from the books you loved most earlier in your life? Yes, very much so. Like an example would be Death on the Nile is one of my favorite novels from Agatha Christie. I loved the novel when I was a kid, and the last time I tried to reread it, I could not get into it at all. And that's true with a lot of books that I read when I was younger and have come back to, no matter what genre it is. And I'm not entirely sure how I can explain that changing interest. That's how my reading life has evolved, and it is incredibly difficult for me to sometimes get into books that aren't what I'm interested in at the moment. Question number 2. Do you find yourself choosing different kinds of books at different periods of the year? For example, do the seasons affect what you read for pleasure? Similarly, might you read very different kinds of books while on vacation? So I don't really understand the concept of seasonal reading. I myself don't really do it outside of maybe something on BookTube or like a tradition of maybe reading a specific book at a certain time of the year. But otherwise, I don't really think of my reading or of books in seasonal terms. And as far as vacation books are concerned, what exactly is a vacation? Question number 3. Do specific experiences in your life ever shape what you choose to read? For example, did you read obsessively about child rearing when your kids were little, about gardening as spring is about to begin, about the experience of grief when somebody you loved died, etc.? No, not really. What's going on in my life has never affected what I choose to read. Question number 4. Have there been any times in your life when circumstances have limited or changed your reading in some way? Perhaps caretaking responsibilities, or a big move that made it hard to find as much time to read as you'd like, or personal illness that made it harder to concentrate, or maybe just long-term travel that might have limited your book choices. How do you deal with those circumstances? Sometimes this has affected my reading. For example, if my mom's in the hospital, and if I'm going to spend a significant amount of time in the hospital with her, then my reading choices are, of course, limited to what I brought along with me. There are also times when I'm not doing very well mentally, what I describe as having a meltdown, and that can make things incredibly difficult for me to read. Or even come back to a book that I was reading when I had the meltdown and try to redeem it. An example is The Opium War by Julia Lovell, which I was reading and fairly enjoying until I had a meltdown one afternoon, and I just could not get back into that book at all. And really, the dealing with those circumstances is, of course, being mindful what you're packing, what you're taking along if it's the sort of family emergency or travel or whatever. And then the mental issue, it's more just waiting for it to be over. Question number 5, which I'm going to have to move the computer up to do and come back and bring up the camera, because a few weeks ago I was doing a different tag, or trying to do a different tag, and basically there were a lot of questions, and I had the YouTube video up, but not playing, obviously. And the camera was in the background, and the computer got dark and kind of shut down. And I had about 20 minutes of material that just went away. That annoyed me immensely. Anyway, moving on to question number 5. BookTube is full of discussions of reading slumps, when dedicated readers seem to lose interest for a while in books. Sometimes they just can't find a book that appeals to them. Have you ever experienced a slump? If so, how did you handle it? If not, do you have any advice to give people who are experiencing slumps? So, I think I have experienced reading slumps. In my case, they are a series of poor reading choices at the moment. The most recent example would be about mid-month last October, when I was trying to read there was a whole week of me reading or trying to read a number of books, and I just could not get into any of them. And my best solution, well, for me, I think what it is that there are books that I'm in the mood for that are not necessarily what I've put on my reading docket. It's sort of, so I like to make reading plans. The problem is that when it comes time to actually executing those reading plans, I'm in the mood for something else. And my best piece of advice is figure out what it is that you're actually wanting to read and read that. Question number 6. Booktubers also talk about book hangovers, when readers are so moved by a book that they find it difficult to move on to a new book. Have you ever felt this way? Yes. Last year, I got my, so it was, I think, on a Saturday, I got my November manga orders in. And so I read them over the course of Saturday morning. And the last book was the 30th volume of Eden Zero by Hiro Mashima, and it was so moving. I was just transported. It was magical. And then I was reading the collected poems of C.B. Cavafy, which I had enjoyed. I've read it before and enjoyed it, but like this reread after Eden Zero, it was just no contest whatsoever. And that kind of put me down for a little bit. Question number 7. Tell us about a few books that almost always work for you. Something that might have remained a favorite throughout your life despite any changing reading tastes. Something that always seems to hit just the right spot when you need a lift. Perhaps some lifetime book hangover where the text will always be at the back of your mind. The only book that comes to mind is View with a Grain of Sand by Wislawa Szymborska. It's a selected collection of her poetry. That is I think the only book that has ever worked for me whenever I have read it. Everything else I have had various issues at one point or another. And finally, question number 8, tag people. If you would like to do this tag, consider yourselves tagged. In a BookTube, I will be back tomorrow for a new video, maybe a tag video, maybe something else, hopefully. Anyway, until I see you next time, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.